It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this Lunch and Learn, my friend and colleague with whom I've had the pleasure of engaging in all kinds of Jewish discussions and whose family I've had the pleasure of knowing. So it's both a personal and a professional joy to introduce you to Rabbi Professor Joseph A. Skloot. Rabbi Skloot is the Rabbi Aaron D. Painkin Assistant Professor of Modern Jewish Intellectual History at HUC-JIR on our New York campus, where he is also the Associate Director of the Tisch Star Fellowship Program. He received his PhD in Jewish History from Columbia University, his rabbinical ordination from HUC-JIR, and his AB in History from Princeton University. For those of you who aren't used to the Princeton, Chicago thing where they insist on making it AB instead of BA, it means BA. Skloot is a historian of Jewish culture and religious thought in the early modern and modern periods. His research explores the history of Hebrew books, Jewish-Christian relations, the development of Jewish law, and Reform Jewish theology. His first book, First Impressions, Sefer Hasidim, and Early Modern Hebrew Printing, was published by Brandeis University Press, won the Jordan Schnitzer Award from the Association for Jewish Studies, and perhaps most importantly, was featured on the College Commons podcast in a conversation which I was delighted to have with Joe about our very topic today for the symposium and for Joe's talk. His book describes how 16th century Hebrew printers, both Jewish and Christian, transformed the heterogeneous corpus of manuscripts into a canonical book, and by extension, how Jewish sacred texts, long thought to be eternal and unchanging, were in fact created by and for human beings with specific agendas and interests. Today, we will hear from Dr. Skloot, who will present to us on the topic of printing, praying, and performing Jewish identity in early modern Italy, maḥzor, Kimha.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Holo. Thank you, Yoram Biton, a hero of mine and guardian of the treasures in this library and our whole library system, and water carrier as well. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here at this symposium. I want to say a word just about this gathering of scholars from around the world to consider the Hebrew and Jewish book in the early modern world, which is the brilliance in this space is unprecedented. And I'm so grateful to my colleagues for coming to Cincinnati and making use of the extraordinary treasures of our library here and celebrating this collection. PowerPoint up? Yes, it is. It's up. Today, you will be exploring with me one particular Hebrew book that was printed in 1540, a prayer book. And I'm going to use this prayer book as a window into to understanding Jewish culture a little bit, a Jewish culture in Italy in the early modern period. There was a handout that I hope was distributed. Do we have it? It will become useful in a few moments. So when it arrives, we'll turn to it. But I want to begin by noting that in 1940, with the assistance of the Refugee Scholars Project, which Dr. Michael Meyer has written about, Isaiah Zana, the celebrated bibliographer and historian and former director of the Collegio Rabbinico on Rhodes, arrived in Cincinnati to assume the position of librarian here at the Cloud Library. A decade and a half beforehand, following the completion of his PhD in Zurich, while teaching at the Jewish school in Lodz, Zona penned an appraisal of Italian Jewish culture entitled Ha-Yahadut Ha-Italkit Dmuta Umekoma B'Toldot Am Yisrael, Italian Judaism, its image and place within the history of the Jewish people. In this essay, Zona offered a rather unflattering portrait, having absorbed the insights and innovations of others. He said, Italian Jews, he wrote, did not write a new page in the book of Judaism's creativity. While in later works, whether in later works he revised this view, and he spent the rest of his life, his time here, searching the world for manuscripts and printed books from Italy. Whether he softened his perspective is a question for his biographers, and a biography is being written now. But here I would like to note how Zona's argument about Italian Judaism, Ha-Yahadut Ha-Italkit, Zona's argument more recently has functioned to generate a whole library of scholarship on the distinctiveness of Italian Jewish culture, early modern Italian Jewish culture specifically. How do I advance the slide? This way. There you go. So in my presentation today, I'd like to home in on the question, by looking at this single Hebrew title produced in 1540. That is a 2-volume Hebrew maḥzor, prayer book for the full yearly festival cycle, printed by the ha-shutafim, the partners of Bologna, who operated a press in that city from 1536 to 1540. I have been engaged in a number of research projects dealing with the partners and the 9 books they printed for the last few years. And this impressive maḥzor, it was part of a spate of prayer books featuring the liturgical custom of the Italian Jews, known as the Minhag B'nai Roma, or the Minhag Italiani, or the Nusach Loazim. Angelo Piatelli has counted 30 of these titles, 30 prayer books according to the Minhag B'nai Roma. He's counted 30 of them printed between the years 1485 and 1600. And that's quite a sum. And 3 of these titles were printed prior to 1500. That is in the area of the first printed books, the incunabula. Those 3 incunabula of the maḥzor of the prayers of the B'nai Roma, those 3 incunabula, they exceed the number of other Jewish liturgies of other rites. Today, I would like to argue that these books were a reflection of a Jewish community engaged in a process of self-definition, boundary maintenance, play, and subversion. Ultimately, I would like to suggest that these prayer books and the partners' maḥzor in particular, this one here, have something to teach us about what distinguished Italian Jewry in the early modern period, or better, the desire of Italian Jews to distinguish themselves from other Jews in the peninsula. My thinking about these matters has been informed by the work of Jonathan Ray, who has argued that Sephardi identity was not so much a medieval phenomenon, but rather a construct that emerged in the aftermath of 1492. He writes, the exiles of 1492 did not bring with them any concrete sense of ancestral Spanish homeland. Rather, such a notion only evolved over the course of the 16th century as a result of 3 interconnected factors. Ray goes on to explain that this sense of Iberianness among the exiles emerged from what he calls a shared experience of hardship, a confrontation with local Jewries who defined them by their experience of exile, and 3, a nostalgia for an idealized Spanish past. He gives scant attention to the ways printed Hebrew books might have helped construct a Sephardi identity in the years following the exile, but it's not an unreasonable supposition, and presentations that we've heard here already today in this symposium would lead to that suggestion as well. namely that in the years following the exile, the classics of the Iberian Jewish library were printed and printed again, especially in Italy, and those books helped fashion a sense of Iberianness. In the context of this presentation, I'd like to suggest that raise arguments about the contingency of Sephardi identity and its emergence during the early modern period might be analogized to Italian Jewish identity in the same period. And to paraphrase Ray, that during the 16th century, when confronted with the arrival of other Jewries on the peninsula, in particular the increasingly visible migrants from Spain and Portugal, some Jews on the peninsula began to stress their Italianness and did so by printing and using prayer books as explicitly identified as those according to the Minhag B'nai Roma. My thinking on this question has also been influenced by the work of Adam Seligman, Robert Weller, Michael Pewitt, and Simon Bennett, who in a wide-ranging and ambitious work have argued that previous generations of theorists of ritual, such as Durkheim and Bloch, have overemphasized the literalist, individualistic, and hierarchical elements of ritual. They claim instead that ritual creates, and this is a complex idea that I'll tease out over the next few minutes. They claim that ritual creates a subjunctive as if or could be universe. It is this creative act that makes a shared social world possible. Their idea is that through rituals, participants imagine alternate realities patently at variance with the present one, and in doing so, articulate and subvert the boundaries of community. They stress the element of play involved here, the idea that ritual is a kind of performance, a game where one engages in creative self-fashioning in relation to real or imagined others. The sheer number of prayer books prominently titled Minhag B'nai Roma in the first century of Hebrew printing indicates both the perceived demand and the actual demand for such volumes. Some of these acquired a kind of iconic status, in particular, the one that I'm focusing on here, the maḥzor B'nai Roma of 1540 from Bologna. The text of the prayers in this maḥzor was copied over and again by successive printers in the generations that followed. And according to Piatelli, Stephanie Sigmund has shown how in 1609, the deputies of the Jewish community of Florence forbade anyone from reciting prayers other than, quote, those in the Italian manner found in the recently reprinted prayer book, the maḥzor Bolognese, that is the maḥzor of Bologna. And Michael Rishik has noted that despite the diversity of Jewish liturgies available, with the maḥzor, the Bologna maḥzor, the maḥzor B'nai Roma achieved a kind of unity. It has been noted by many scholars, beginning with Zunz, that the liturgy of the maḥzor, the Italian maḥzor, ultimately published in Bologna, was based on Babylonian models with the addition of many piyutim from the Mediterranean and other elements of the Palestinian tradition, and Dr. Saracen can say more about this, I'm sure. The prayer texts contained in this maḥzor, printed in a beautiful clear typeface that you can see here, and subject to intensive proofreading, achieved a kind of enduring impact. The commentary around them, however, was not reprinted in the years following its appearance until just a few years ago. So you can see here is the core text of the Hebrew prayers. You have the hymn Adon Olam, well known. This is the first page, and then you see the commentary around the outside. The commentary was not reprinted, but the actual version of the prayer text was. But it's the commentary that I want to focus on here today. because I think it opens up a window into that process of self-definition that occurred among early modern Jews in Italy in the wake of the Spanish exile and the spread of printing. This commentary was written by Rabbi Yohanan ben Yosef Treves, aka Trabo, and he intended this work to be anonymous, and he credited the book entirely to its printers, that is the ha-shutafim, the partners of Bologna. Only in a subsequent work, a Haggadah, Treves notes that he actually was the one who wrote this commentary. And according to Alexander Marx, Treves was born around 1490 and died around 1557, 1560. He lived a peripatetic life, traveling around the Italian peninsula. He studied in Ferrara. He worked for the banker Ishmael Rieti. In Bologna, he worked with the aforementioned ha-shutafim, and he ended his life in Venice working for Daniel Bomberg. A number of features are notable in Treves's commentary. I'm going to give you 5 of them. First, he offers an uncompromising emphasis on the importance of kavanah in prayer. Kavanah, I'm going to translate here provisionally as intention, but I want us to explore that a little bit more in a few moments. 2, he draws extensively, lifts many passages from the Sefer Abudarham, the 14th century commentary on the liturgy by the Andalusian scholar and student of Jacob ben Asher. 3, he offers a critique of prayer books printed before his as inaccurate. 4, his critique, he offers another critique, a piquant critique of his co-religionists as ignorant and insufficiently conscientious worshipers. And he has a desire to remediate those problems. And 5, he seeks to integrate both the rationalist and the esoteric traditions. So I would like to suggest that when taken together, these 5 features represent an attempt to fashion what Seligman and his fellow ritual theorists might call the subjunctive world of Italian Jewish culture, by imagining and negotiating the boundaries of that culture. Boundaries, they write, while they must exist, must also be porous and less than fully discriminatory. That is, empathy, and here I would add the words communal cohesion, must rest on the very type of duality between boundaries and their dissolution that we argue occurs in both ritual and play. The balance between continuity and creativity occurs through the accepted conventions of movement across subjunctive boundaries, not through the denial of boundaries and the concomitant ideal of free limits and constraints, nor through totalistic assumptions of self, other, and society. And I'm going to try to tease this out, this idea out as we talk in a few moments. So in the city of Bologna, in the 3rd decade of the 16th century, the issue of communal cohesion was especially fraught. In the first decades of the century, the city, host to a long-standing Jewish community, had recently become home to an influx of refugees, prominently among them the Jews from Iberia, but also from Florence and Rome, displaced by the interminable wars of the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. As Bernard Cooperman has noted, the arrival of new populations of Jews in the city led to a jockeying for power as well as collaboration. And the partners' press in the city may be seen as an example of that collaboration. The members of the partners themselves included both members of the long-standing Bolognese Jewish community and those who traced their lineage back to Spain and Portugal, as well as Treves himself, who according to Marx was of French lineage. In another context, I have argued that, following David Ruderman, that the partners' press represented a kind of identifiably Italian ethnic boundary crossing, something we heard about this morning. Here, I'd like to look closely at Treves's commentary and point out the ways in which he plays at the margins of Italian Jewish identity and thereby affirms and performs its boundaries. Treves situates his commentary within a fierce polemic against his co-religionists and the prayer books they use. And I'm going to begin, and the first text I want us to look at is the first text on the handout. And this is a provisional transcription and translation. So in the aftermath of printing, he tells us in his Hakdama, his introduction, there is an abundance of printed liturgies available, including 10, according to the Roman rite, the Minhag B'nai Roma. Treves' fellow Jews he calls poor dullards, who cover themselves in their prayer shawls before the Lord and pour out their complaints and twitter like a crane or a swallow, as if they're just reading boilerplate. My idiomatic translation. They read what is before them in their maḥzorim without comprehension, in their prayer books adorned with songs, poems, and there's my mistake, with songs and poems. They proclaim in unison on the new moons and festivals, flood like Korach's fire pans that were hammered into plating. Distortions arose in all of them in their printing. So he's making a strong critique both of the printed books that they're using and of the ritual act itself, or the intention around it, which I want to discuss. He then articulates a novel way of framing the act of prayer, which he argues is unlike the public reading of the Torah scroll. When reading the Torah, one may make an error and still fulfill one's obligation, he tells us, drawing on the words of the Talmud and Tosafot. However, this is not the case with prayers which require correct intention, kavana nechona, as is written in the Sefer Mitzvot HaKatan, to spread one's lips and bring forth every word like a person who counts his coins. This is all the more so the case for a layman. Laymen, he tells us, because of the ubiquitous of printed liturgies, more often than not, have no idea what they're saying. And they repeat in folly and foolishness the distortions fixed in their mouths. Here we encounter the oft-repeated 16th century lament that printing leads to distortion, misinformation, and all manner of foolishness, one that we hear regularly today about other media. The solution for most people, especially printers, of course, was not the rejection of printing outright, but better printing and better education as well. Indeed, I have written about how the Partners Press in Bologna might be seen as part of a broader popular educational movement in 16th century Italy, made possible by printing. In the face of the innumerable temptations of the early modern city, this educational movement was meant to improve popular piety and integrate venerable intellectual traditions, the rationalist and the esoteric philosophy and Kabbalah. And I would suggest that this is not unlike what Yehuda Galinsky has described for about 14th century Spain. We also see here, though, another kind of argument, an example of what Seligman and his co-authors have called a characteristically modern obsession with sincerity. The idea that the words one says aloud ritually must be accurately representations not of the as-if or shared subjunctive universe of the world, but instead they project an as-is vision of what often becomes a totalistic, unambiguous vision of reality as it is. Treves makes precisely this point in a later commentary on the words of the Amidah, the 18 benedictions, citing an obscure midrash found in the 14th century Italian halachic word shibbolei haleket. He tells us that each benediction refers to the natural order of things, seder olam. Elsewhere, when explaining the poem El Adon, inserted in the first benediction prior to the recitation of the Shema in the morning, Treves writes that it must be understood, this poem must be understood as reflecting the proper configuration and appearance of the heavenly bodies. When the poem reads, the words filled with splendor, Treves tells us that it recalls the tradition that the moon, quote, the moon being the smallest among the stars, does not have her own splendor, but receives it from the sun, her husband. And further, that the sun is more visible and exposed to all the world with regard to the fact that he is a large body, sometimes larger than the earth, and the moon with her smallness is as her being closer to us, she derives her splendor from the sun and shines. If you're confused, this is precisely what the average worshiper is supposed to cognize in the act of saying this prayer. It's not an easy thing. Here, Treves is integrating Maimonides' cosmology, found in the introduction to his commentary of the Mishnah, based on the medieval Spanish astronomer Al-Battani, who digested Ptolemy for his Arab audience, as well as the rabbinic tradition about the shrinking of the moon and its esoteric Iberian gloss transmitted by Rabbi David Kimha, perhaps as well in the as yet unprinted Zohar. It is somewhat ironic that Treves expected his words, dullard co-religionists, to be able to contextualize this liturgical poem with reference to a potpourri of traditions. But such comprehension was essential because the stakes were high. If his co-religionists failed to offer their prayers with the proper comprehension, havana, and intention, kavana, as well as pronunciation, they would leave God's presence empty-handed. As Treves says in his commentary on the recitation of the 13 attributes of mercy, it is necessary to direct one's intention, HUC-JIR, on them, and as I explained in my introduction, that one should not think that a prayer will be heard if it is not said with intention, kavanah. He goes on to instruct the worshiper to think about each and every one of these 13 attributes as if he were a man who petitions a king, that the king should bestow upon him his riches, his silver, his gold, or his perfumes and his treasure houses. The king has treasuries aplenty and rooms full of good things. His co-religionists, he tells us, are like men who do not know how to ask how to go to the treasure house, which the king has summoned him on account of his petition, because they lack proper kavanah. It's worth dwelling for a moment on this term kavanah, which Treves uses repeatedly in its nominal and verbal forms, and which he associates with Havana, comprehension. It seems to me that Treves used the term both to express the correct meaning of the words that the worshiper utters, and the correct meaning and their correct oral articulation. A person who, he says, who misvocalizes a word of a prayer because he's seeking to ornament his reading fails to fulfill his obligation. Further reflection, I think, on what he means by this term kavanah and what the term meant in its context is especially important. I would like to suggest that in his maḥzor commentary, which surrounded what he perceived as and what became the definitive edition of the Minhag B'nai Roma, Treves was playing at the boundaries of Italian Jewish identity. Even as he himself articulated an as-is understanding of Jewish ritual, where worshipers, through their prayers, affirmed the correct conceptions of the seder olam, the natural order of things. Treves was also imagining an as-if aspirational understanding of the Italian Jewish community. This is embodied in the mise en page of the commentary. With the core text at the center of page is the liturgy according to the Minhag B'nai Roma. You can see here from the second volume, this is Kol Nidre. Of course, those of you who have the good eyesight can tell that it doesn't say Kol Nidre, that this is the declaration said on the eve of Yom Kippur. It says Kol Nidarim, which is one of the features of the Minhag B'nai Roma. And then you see at the margins, you see his commentary here. And there's this gutter in between. It is notable that much of this commentary, including the section on Kol Nidre, is lifted directly from the Sefer Abu Darham, that 14th century Andalusian commentary on the Sephardic liturgy. Only in certain instances, such as those I've highlighted here today, does Treves insert his own insights and those of other scholars, some from Italian and Ashkenazic tradition, into the matrix of the Seder Abu Darham. Now, the Sefer Abu Darham. The Sefer Abu Darham was printed twice prior to the printing of the partner's maḥzor. So it's likely that Treves, in fashioning his commentary, worked with one of those printed editions, and that's a question I want to follow up on. But note here how this graphical textual structure, the Italian Jewish liturgy at the center, with the Andalusian commentary on the borders, recalls Seligman and his co-author's notion of ritual as a form of self-definition and play at boundaries. In the chaotic multi-ethnic mix of early modern Bologna, where different Jewish groups were jockeying for supremacy and, in Ruderman's words, where boundaries were being blurred, the possibility of an inviolate, rigid boundary between the Roman rite at the center and the Andalusian exegesis at the margins is imagined. He imagines a rigid hierarchy that does not and cannot exist in the reality of the city where he's living. It is what Seligman calls a subjunctive world, an as-if world. And further, the insertion of Treves's own voice into the Abu Darham might be seen as an example of play, of flirting with the subversion of those boundaries so rigidly articulated by the white space of the gutter between the liturgical text and the commentary. Zana, in his youth, may have wished to deny the distinctiveness of Italian Jewish culture and seen it as purely derivative. This claim, as has been pointed out by Bonfil and Ruderman, among others, is inherently subjective and of dubious value. My purpose here, though, is not to disprove it so much as to show how in the early modern period after the advent of printing, the category of Italian Jewish culture itself, of Italian Judaism, to use Zana's term, ha-Yahadut ha-Italkit, was being imagined, performed, and contested by Jews themselves, including the partners of Bologna and Yohanan Treves. Thank you very much. Shai, please.
Can I start? Sorry,
Yoram, do you intend, should we go to questions?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Please.
Tell us about these partners. Who are these? How is printing done collectively?
So, thank you so much. I love the.
One more thing.
Oh, sure.
What language is he commenting on? Is he commenting in Hebrew? In the commentary.
Okay.
Hebrew or Judeo-Italian or what?
Great. Thank you for asking those questions. So I could spend a lot of time talking about the partners, and I will have to hold myself back. So that's just the term, ha-shutafim in Hebrew, the partners. That's the term that's used on the title pages of their books. Ha-shutafim, osei melechet hameshi, the partners who are engaged in the work of silk. These are men who get condotta from the Pope to engage in silk work in Bologna. Bologna is a center for silk production, most important, at that moment, the most important center of silk production. And it seems they use that the starting capital that they accumulate in the silk business to fund this enterprise of printing, which they get a condotta for as well from the Pope. So it means that they're well connected too, right? They are able to engage in the jockeying, the negotiation for power with the Holy See. And we have their Condotta, and it's a remarkable document. It talks about how the Pope is giving them, it's actually confirmed twice after they receive it initially, and that they have the permission to print a Bible, the Grace After Meals, and other works that do not contain the name of Jesus or blaspheme him. So but they also include a fellow named Abraham ben Moshe HaKohen, Avraham ben Moshe HaKohen, who is one of the leading rabbinic figures, an exile from Spain, and may have brought with him an extraordinary library. I wonder if some of the sources that are being used here in this commentary that Treves writes are from this library that he relies on. And so, and we know that he's also because he lives tax-free status. He has a right to travel around the papal states with his library, Abraham ben Moshe Cohen. So we know that he has wealth as well, and he says in one of his in a colophon that he spent his money to. But also Treves in his introduction says, "I want to thank these printers, these shutafim," and he lists their names, for spending their own hard-earned money to produce these books. Of course, they only produced 9 books. Something happens right after the production of this where they disappear from the record. And I have some thoughts about that. But and then just to ask about the commentary. The commentary is written in Hebrew. What?
Wrong Kavanah.
Wrong Kavanah. The commentary is in Hebrew, but the Abudarham is in Hebrew and Aramaic mixed, and there's all sorts of Aramaic sources. What's notable is, if you look here, the commentary has the words of Kol Nidre in its Aramaic formulation. The core text, which is from Abudarham, the core text is the Hebrew here. So you can see the interplay of the hybridity of this community here, right? You have on display right here on this page. Yeah, Michaela.
Thank you so much. I have a question concerning the contents, right, in some of these passages. So, what's the place of Kabbalah in this, in this commentary? Because, of course, this is, pre-Safidian, right, Kabbalah. But the Zohar was, very well known. And it seems to me that although it refers right to Kimha, which by the way was a very much read, right, wrote, right, his books were read by Italian Jews, very much popular. But for example, the description of this is Yom Kippur Katan, right, and it seems to me that it's based on the Zohar, actually, this passage.
So
am I correct, or?
I mean, this is one of the areas that I really want to follow up. Oh, sorry. So so the question was about the place of Kabbalah, perhaps the Zohar, in this text. This is a question that I'm interested in for a few different reasons. One is because I'm interested in the fact that the bibliographers who have looked at this maḥzor have said, "Oh yes, this is a Kabbalistic commentary." They've identified it as Kabbalistic, and I think the reason why they don't specify it. Heller, for instance, also Friedberg, is because in the colophon, he talks about how he is going to interpret the secrets of the piyutim. He has interpreted the secrets of the piyutim according to the Sodot and the Kabbalah. So he says explicitly, he uses those terms in the colophon. But I would like to, my reading, and I'm going through it, and I've gone through both volumes, and is that it is not as Kabbalistic as he says at the end, or as the bibliographers interpret it as Kabbalistic. Definitely, so this passage here, so I think that he could have gotten to this Kabbalistic reading of El Adon, or this esoteric reading of El Adon, without knowing the Zohar, and which of course hadn't been printed yet and was relatively unknown.
Is it possible that he decided, intentionally to underplay the Kabbalistic element and to use, for example, Kimha, which was very well known, as I said, to reach a larger, a wider?
I think that he both underplayed and overplayed. I think in the colophon, he overplayed the Kabbalistic element of it because that's going to attract purchasers and readers, and because there's interest. And in the text itself, I think he underplays it. And the question is, yes, was he familiar with traditions that, like Danny Abrams has an article precisely about this idea of the moon and the sun in the Zohar.
Yeah.
And the question is, could he have gotten to the same conclusion just from reading Kimha, or was he familiar with something that was going to become the Zohar later? That's, I think, worth more thought.
Yeah. It was Ashkenazi, right?
Yes, Treves was. That's what Marx thinks, and I think that's very likely. Yes. Yeah, Dr. Saracen.
So I just want to pick up on something that you just said, which I think maybe makes more sense than one of the things you were trying to say earlier, the hybridity of the commentary. I mean, on the one hand, Obadiah is sort of, at that point, was the most recent, most extensive commentary. Sure, you have Shibboleth Haleket, which is Italian, but it would seem to me that rather than imagining a rigid hierarchy here, the commentary itself expresses the hybridity of what's going on in the culture. That is to say, here you have a Sephardic commentary, which, as you say, is at various points is supplemented by his own interpretations and those of others. I'd also want to point out that the Hebrew text of Kol Nidre is what's found in the manuscripts of Seder of Amram. So it's, again, there in terms of the Toldot of the versions. Yeah, exactly. But I'm seeing more hybridity here actually than rigid hierarchy.
I think hybridity. I guess what I want to say is the question is, this is why I like these particular theorists that I turn to, because I think there is both that within the hybridity there is an urge to self-differentiate. That it's precisely out of the hybridity that one needs to fashion one needs to posit a rigid hierarchy. That if and it's precisely the hybridity that generates the anxiety around the need for self-identification, I think.
I mean, certainly putting forth the Binhag B'nai Roma.
Exactly.
Of course. But the fact that the commentary itself is so hybrid.
Exactly.
Exactly.
It's intention. Yeah. And yes, it's intention. I'll just add, also my thinking here has been informed by Roni Weinstein, who has written about this in the context of marriage rituals and other coming of age rituals, right? Where he's talked about this very similar notion, drawing on a different theoretical matrix, but a similar one. So, Jason, yeah.
So I'm just thinking about the hard divide of the white space dynamic, which is visible to someone who's got a copy and invisible to those who don't. Right. So that even though you're creating imagined space, your goal is ultimately to shape attitudes and ideas. So what's the circulation like? Who's got copies of this that there couldn't be, right? The Kehillah only hears what's recited. Right.
So that's the question of circulation, I think, is really a really important one, because as I noted, it's the commentary that is not circulating.
Right.
that this commentary is an attempt, we might even say an idiosyncratic attempt to try to kind of a boundary definition that that Amcha, that is the people, the average people in the synagogue, don't have access to because it's not printed. What is reprinted is the center. The center is reprinted multiple times. And I think it's really evocative, that point at the beginning of in his introduction where he says, these books are the books that they have in their hands, the maḥzorim and sidurim, that these people in the synagogues have in their hands are bad. Right, which means that by 1540, in his universe, in Italy, his co-religionists are praying from printed books in their hands.
Or he's also creating a pseudo-reality, right? Which is that, different Shlichei Tzibur are leading from different texts. So the communities are hearing different texts, but it seems to me affordability is an issue here for the common folk.
Without a doubt.
Not many Sidurim were published these years. So probably speaking about Sidur.
But we, at least I have found, looking at Piatelli and Goldschmidt's bibliographies, you have 30 Sidurim and maḥzorim B'nai Roma, Minhag B'nai Roma, published over 100 years. That's, I'm not saying that everyone.
Part of the 16th century, not the first part.
Also a question, are you printing 150 copies, or are you printing?
See, that's the thing. I think these maḥzorim,
Small run.
these maḥzorim are not, this is not for popular consumption.
Right.
But the press uses the same liturgical, the same liturgy, and they publish a small octavo version without the commentary as well. That is what people are using. They're not using, this is for the Shlichei Tzibur, but the small version is for more general readership, I think.
And also the fact that the comment-
It's a commentary.
It's meant for
It's a
everybody,
commentary.
So the last question. So
Oh, okay. Oh my gosh.
do we have someone from question by Zoom? Yes. No. So I just want to commend you on excellent presentation that demonstrates the superior scholarship of the advanced scholars at Hebrew Union College. I also want to give a shout out to David Amram, who has written a book on Italian Hebrew printing, and who was a Reformed Jew, who was, an ordinary person, who was a lawyer, but he was not, a scholar. And it shows us that we really belong in this conversation because we're all in it together. Your theme of printing, praying, and performance. But the people who come to see this exhibit and to hear about these books are interested in Italy. Italy has unique significance in the history of art. Its influence from Ravenna to Rome, to today is constant. And the Jews are the exact opposite. Whereas Christians and Christian scholars stress text and image, Jews are concerned with text and commentary. The illustrations obviously are not coming from printers, they're coming many times from non-Jewish artists and so on. But my question is this: the last time I was in the Tempio in Rome on Shabbat, I could not understand a word, not a single word that the Shliach Tzibur said. They sang Adon Olam, I couldn't recognize a single Hebrew word. And when they said the Kaddish, this is only blocked from the Vatican, they stand up and they go up and down like this as they say the words of Kaddish. So my question is that Italy is very important, and they claim that they are the oldest and the most authentic community in the world. Today, Roman, and this is part of the reason why these books are being circulated and created and distributed and reprinted. And it's, they're preaching to the faithful themselves their own importance because they are in Rome. My question to you is Roma as significant as the Romans?
Oh, that's quite a question. Well, I'll just encourage you to speak with. First of all, I will say thank you for highlighting the scholarly the fact that HUC-JIR is a center of scholarship, of Jewish research, of critical engagement with our books and texts. The fact that Isaiah Zana was here and was the librarian here is one example among others of the import of Italian Jewish culture and cultural productivity to the Hebrew Union College, and our extraordinary library, which has all of these titles produced in Italy. The fact that we have this complete collection almost is remarkable. I'm not going to opine about what happens among Jews in Rome today. I feel that is beyond my area of expertise. No matter how much time I like to spend in Roma, but I will just suggest, if you're interested in this question of Jewish, non-Jewish images, etc., the written word, our colleague Ishai Mishori here has a lot to say about this question, and he's sitting right back there. So I would encourage you to reach out to him and to say that I do think that the history of the cultural productivity of Italian Jews and the sense of identity, that is Italianness, is a crucial direction for continued study here at HUC. And I thank you for the opportunity to make that case.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for everybody for coming in here and also by Zoom. And thank you very much for coming. And we hope to see you again. And we want to highlight the exhibition that we have here that Abigail Becken and Thomas and other people at the library were working on it for a long time. So please come and see the Siddur. It's here and other materials from Italy.